At 9:30 p.m. on the 3rd of April 1974, the town of Guin, Alabama, population just over 2,000, was in darkness. The power had been out for nearly an hour. The sky was low and black. There was no siren. The telephone lines were dead. What was about to hit them had already been on the ground for more than 30 minutes, moving northeast at 55 miles per hour, tracking a path of total destruction across western Alabama. No one in Guin knew it was coming. At 8:50 p.m., the National Weather Service in Birmingham had issued a severe thunderstorm warning for western Alabama. At 9:05, they upgraded it to a tornado warning for Fayette and Lamar counties. But the warning was broadcast on television and radio, and by 9:05, many towns in the path had already lost electricity. The warning never reached the people in Guin. The only way to hear it was through battery-powered radios, and in 1974, not every household had one. There was no NOAA Weather Radio network as it exists today. There was no automated alert system. There were no cell phones. The warning existed as a piece of paper in the hands of a few weathermen, but it did not exist in the ears of the people who needed it most. At 9:10 p.m., the tornado had already destroyed the town of Vernon, Alabama, 12 miles southwest of Guin. In Vernon, it killed 33 people. The town was simply erased. The storm did not weaken after Vernon. It crossed the line into Lamar County, and its energy was still building. The funnel was now a mile wide. The wind speeds were later estimated at over 300 miles per hour. That is not a number that means much in abstract, but it is the wind speed that tears concrete blocks apart and scatters them like gravel. It is the wind speed that lifts railroad cars and deposits them in fields. It is the wind speed at which a 2x4 becomes a projectile that can pierce a concrete wall. This was an F5 tornado, the highest classification on the Fujita scale, though that scale would not be formally adopted for another year. But when the damage was surveyed, there was no doubt. At 9:30 p.m., the tornado entered the town of Guin. The storm struck from the southwest. The first structures to go were the homes on the outskirts. The tornado did not discriminate by size or construction. Frame houses disintegrated. Brick homes were reduced to their foundations. Mobile homes were not found afterward, only the chassis remained. The tornado passed directly over the Guin High School, which was built of brick and steel. The roof was peeled off, walls collapsed. The gymnasium, the largest open space in town, was gutted. Inside the school at that hour, there was a band practice. 22 students and their director had stayed late to prepare for a competition. When the power went out, they moved into the hallway, the safest place they could think of. The building did not hold. 11 of those students and the band director were killed. The others were pulled from the wreckage with broken bones and head injuries. The tornado continued northeast through the residential district. Entire blocks of houses were swept clean, trees were debarked, cars were wrapped around utility poles. The human toll was immediate and horrific. At 9:35 p.m., the tornado exited the town. It continued on for another 20 miles before finally lifting near the town of Delmer. When it lifted, the total number of dead in Lamar County stood at 58. 33 of them were in Guin. Another 266 people were injured. The entire town of Guin was essentially destroyed. 9 out of 10 structures were either destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The hospital was gone. The water tower was down. The fire station was a pile of rubble. The town had no power, no water, no communications, and no medical facility. What happened that night was not a single failure. It was a chain of failures, each one compounding the next. The Weather Service had issued a warning, but it did not reach the people. The warning was broadcast over radio and television, but the power was out. There was no backup system. There was no plan for what to do when the electricity failed. The tornado was large and violent, but it was also slow-moving by tornado standards, 55 miles per hour. That meant it was trackable. It could have been forecast more precisely, but the technology of 1974 did not allow for that. The only radar available to the Weather Service was the WSR-57, a radar designed in the 1950s. It could detect precipitation, but it could not measure wind speeds inside a storm. It could not see a tornado directly. The only way to know if a tornado was on the ground was to see it. Spotters were relied upon, but the storm was moving at night and the spotters could not see it until it was on top of them. The tornado itself was part of a larger event. The 3rd of April 1974 was the first day of what would become known as the Super Outbreak. Over the next 18 hours, 148 tornadoes touched down across 13 states. It remains the largest outbreak of tornadoes in American history. The Guin tornado was one of 16 F5 tornadoes that day, though later reanalysis would reduce that number to 15. Even so, no other single day in American history has produced as many violent tornadoes. The outbreak killed 315 people outright and injured 5,000 more. The damage was measured in billions of dollars. But the outbreak did not catch the Weather Service by surprise. Forecasters had known for days that conditions were ripe. On the morning of April 3rd, the National Severe Storms Forecast Center in Kansas City had issued a tornado watch for the entire region. It was one of the first times such a broad watch had been issued, but a watch is not a warning. A watch tells you that conditions are possible. A warning tells you that a tornado is happening, and the distance between a watch and a warning can be the difference between life and death. In Guin, that distance was 12 miles. The tornado had been on the ground for 30 minutes before it hit the town. The Weather Service had issued a warning at 9:05 p.m., 25 minutes before impact, but the warning was useless if no one heard it. And no one heard it. The only person in Guin who might have been able to receive the warning was the town's only ham radio operator. He had been trying to raise someone on the air for an hour, but his antenna had been damaged by the preceding storms. He could not hear the weather bulletins. He could not transmit a warning. So the town sat in the dark, listening to the wind, not knowing that the wind was about to become a wall. After the tornado passed, rescue efforts began immediately, but they were hampered by the same infrastructure failures that had caused the deaths. There were no roads. The roads were blocked by debris. The nearest hospital was in Winfield, 10 miles away, but the hospital in Winfield was not equipped to handle 300 injured people. Ambulances had to use dirt roads. Some victims were transported in pickup trucks. The dead were laid out in a temporary morgue in the back of a grocery store. The National Guard arrived the next morning. The Red Cross set up tents. The town was still without power for days. The water was not safe to drink for weeks. The rebuilding of Guin took years. What investigators found in the aftermath was a hard lesson about the limits of the warning system. The National Weather Service conducted a detailed survey of the outbreak. They interviewed survivors. They mapped the damage. They compared the time of the warnings with the time of the tornadoes. In the case of Guin, they found that the warning had been issued with enough lead time to save lives, but the warning had not been received. The failure was not in the forecast. The failure was in the dissemination. At that time, the only way to get a tornado warning to the public was through commercial radio and television. But when the power went out, the message stopped. There was no battery-operated backup system. There was no siren network in Lamar County. There was no method to send warnings to schools, hospitals, or factories directly. The system assumed that the public would hear the warning through the broadcasters. The system did not account for the possibility that the broadcasters themselves would be silenced by the storm. The Guin tornado became a case study in the need for multiple layers of warning. It contributed directly to the development of the NOAA Weather Radio system, which began rolling out in the mid-1970s. It led to the creation of the Fujita scale, which gave the public a way to understand the severity of tornado damage. It also led to changes in how tornado warnings were issued. After 1974, the National Weather Service began encouraging local governments to install outdoor warning sirens, especially in rural communities. Sirens had existed before, but they were not widespread. In the aftermath of the Super Outbreak, many towns across the Midwest and South invested in siren systems. Guin itself installed a siren after the tornado, but it did not save the lives that were already lost. The question of why the warning did not get through is a simple one, but it leads to deeper questions about how we prepare for disasters. In 1974, the United States had the most advanced tornado forecasting capability in the world. The forecasters at the Severe Storms Forecast Center could see the storm coming days in advance. They could track it on radar. They could pinpoint the counties at risk. But the technology to deliver the warning to every person in those counties did not exist. The gap between what was known and what was communicated was fatal. That gap has since been closed, but it has not been eliminated. Even today, in the age of smartphones and social media, there are still places where warning systems fail. The Guin tornado is a reminder that the best forecast in the world is useless if no one hears it. Who was involved in the response to the Guin tornado? The National Weather Service, the local emergency management officials, the Red Cross, the National Guard, and the citizens of Lamar County. One of the most telling stories from that night involves a man named James T. Johnson, the principal of Guin High School. He was not at the school when the tornado struck. He was at home. When he saw the storm approaching, he drove toward the school to check on the band practice. He never made it. His car was lifted and thrown into a field. He survived with a broken leg, but he could not help anyone. When he crawled out of the wreckage, he saw the school was gone. He spent the rest of the night walking through the debris looking for his students. He found 11 of them dead. He found the band director dead. He found others alive. He helped carry the wounded to the road. He worked through the night without medical supplies, without light, without any sense of how many were still trapped. He would later say that he never heard a warning. Not even a whisper. That is the human consequence. The systems failed, but the people did not. The people of Guin responded as best they could, given what they had. They dug through the rubble with their hands. They carried the injured on doors. They built fires to signal for help. They did not wait for someone to arrive. They acted, but they also could have been saved. Many of them could have been in shelters, in basements, in safe rooms if only they had known. The warning system was the missing link, and that missing link cost 33 lives in one small town. So the Guin tornado is not just a story about a storm. It is a story about the gap between knowledge and action. It is a story about how one physical infrastructure, a power grid, and one communication infrastructure, a radio station, can fail in concert, creating a silence that kills. It is a story that still matters because that gap still exists even if it is narrower. Every time a tornado warning is issued and someone does not hear it, the ghost of Guin is there. The lesson of 1974 is that warnings must reach the people, not just the airwaves. The technology to predict tornadoes has improved enormously since then. Doppler radar can now see the rotation inside the storm. Satellite imagery can show the storm forming. Computers can model the atmosphere with incredible precision. But the final mile of the warning system, the mile from the bulletin to the eardrum, is still the hardest to cover. And in Guin, that mile was never covered at all. The failure in Guin was not an isolated event. Across the super outbreak of April 3, 1974, the same pattern repeated itself in dozens of communities. Warnings were issued. Forecasters knew the danger. But the warnings never reached the people who needed them most. In Limestone County, Alabama, a tornado struck the town of Tanner at 4:30 p.m. on April 3. The National Weather Service had issued a warning 20 minutes earlier, but the power was out, and the only radio station that could have broadcast the warning had taken its transmitter offline because of lightning damage. 28 people died in Tanner. In Madison County, a tornado hit the town of Capshaw at 6:30 p.m. The warning came 10 minutes before impact, but the warning was delivered only over a law enforcement radio channel that no civilians monitored. 11 people died. In DeKalb County, Alabama, a tornado struck the town of Rainsville at 9 p.m. The warning was issued at 8:45 p.m., but the telephone lines were down and the civil defense siren had been disabled by a previous storm. 15 people died. The pattern was everywhere the same. The forecast was accurate, the warning was timely, but the delivery system was broken. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which oversaw the National Weather Service, launched a formal investigation into the outbreak within days. The investigators compiled a report that was released later that year. It was titled The Super Outbreak of April 3, 1974, a preliminary report. It contained a detailed analysis of every tornado, every warning, every death. The report concluded that the primary cause of the high death toll was not the intensity of the storms. It was the failure of the warning dissemination system. The report recommended that the federal government fund a nationwide network of NOAA Weather Radio transmitters, that local communities install outdoor warning sirens, that schools and hospitals be equipped with battery-operated weather radios, and that the National Weather Service develop a standardized system for issuing warnings that could be broadcast simultaneously on multiple channels. These recommendations were not new. They had been made after previous tornado outbreaks, including the Palm Sunday outbreak of 1965. But after the Palm Sunday outbreak, the recommendations were studied, discussed, and then shelved. After the super outbreak, the political pressure was too great to ignore. The death toll was too high, the images too vivid, the stories too heartbreaking. The NOAA Weather Radio system had been in development since the late 1960s, but coverage was sparse. In 1974, there were fewer than 100 transmitters in the entire country. Most were located in coastal areas for marine warnings. The inland United States, where tornadoes were most common, had almost no coverage. After the super outbreak, Congress allocated funding for the expansion of the network. Over the next decade, hundreds of transmitters were installed. By 1985, the NOAA Weather Radio system covered more than 80% of the United States population. It was not a perfect solution. The radios required batteries and many people did not own them, but it was a step forward. It created a direct line from the meteorologist to the citizen, bypassing the commercial broadcasters and the power grid. In Guin, the absence of such a system had been catastrophic. In the years after the tornado, the town installed a NOAA Weather Radio receiver in the local emergency operations center, but that did not help the 33 who were already gone. The question of why no one in Guin heard the warning is not just a technical question, it is a social question. The town of Guin had a population of about 1,500 people in 1974. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone. The school, the church, the grocery store, the cotton gin, these were the centers of daily life. The idea that a warning could be issued and not reach any of these places seems impossible to a modern observer. But in 1974, the information ecosystem was thin. There was no cable television, no internet, no cell phones, no social media. The only source of real-time information was a AM and FM radio, and when the power went out, the radios in people's homes fell silent. The battery-operated radios that existed were often used only for portable music, not for news. The idea of keeping a weather radio in the house was foreign. The concept of a dedicated emergency frequency did not exist for the general public. The only people who routinely monitored weather broadcasts were ham radio operators, and there was only one in Guin. His antenna was damaged. He could not receive the signal. The entire town was blind. The ham radio operator was a man named Robert Bob Smith. He was a retired electrician who had taken up amateur radio as a hobby. He had a transmitter and receiver in his home, and he often served as a volunteer weather spotter. On the evening of April 3rd, he had been monitoring the severe weather net on the 2-meter band. He had heard reports of tornadoes in Mississippi and western Alabama. He knew the storm was coming. He tried to raise the county emergency management office in Vernon, but he could not get through. He tried to contact the National Weather Service in Birmingham, but his signal was too weak. He heard other ham operators reporting damage in neighboring counties, but he could not transmit his own observations because his antenna was down. The storm had knocked it over earlier in the afternoon. He had tried to repair it, but the wind was too strong and the rain was too heavy. He sat in his living room listening to the static, knowing that his town was in the path of a tornado and that he could do nothing. When the tornado hit, his house was damaged. He survived, but he spent the rest of the night wondering what might have been different if his antenna had been intact. After the tornado, the National Weather Service interviewed Bob Smith as part of the investigation. He told them exactly what had happened. The investigators noted his testimony in their report. They also noted that there were no other amateur radio operators in Lamar County. The closest one was in Fayette County, 20 miles away. That operator had heard the warning, but he could not relay it to Guin because he did not know anyone there. The communication network was fragmented. The warning existed, but it had no path to the people. The question then becomes, why did the National Weather Service not have a backup method to reach isolated communities? The answer is that they did, but it was unreliable. The primary method was to call the local telephone company and ask them to broadcast a warning over the telephone lines. This was called a telephone ringdown system. It was used in some parts of the country, but it required that the telephone lines remain operational. In Guin, the telephone lines were knocked out by the same storm that damaged the power lines. The telephone company's central office in Winfield was also affected by the storm, and the switching equipment failed. The ringdown system was useless. The secondary method was to contact the local sheriff's department and ask them to drive through the town with a loudspeaker. But the sheriff's department was overwhelmed by the widespread damage across the county, and they did not have enough officers to cover every road. The roads themselves were flooded and blocked by debris. By the time an officer could reach Guin, the tornado had already passed. The failure was systemic. It was not the fault of any single person. The forecasters in Kansas City had done their job. The meteorologists in Birmingham had done their job. The broadcasters had done their job until they lost power. The telephone company had done its job until the lines went down. The sheriff's department had done its job until they ran out of cars and roads. The system worked perfectly until the moment it broke. And the moment it broke, there was no backup for the backup. The Guin tornado became a case study in the need for redundancy in warning systems. Redundancy means that if one method fails, another method is available, and if that method fails, a third method exists. The goal is to create a web of communication that is so dense that no single failure can silence the warning. In 1974, the web was thin. There was one radio station, one power grid, one telephone line, one ham operator. When all of them failed simultaneously, the silence was absolute. The lessons of Guin were not limited to Alabama. The super outbreak affected 13 states from Alabama to Ohio. In each state, similar failures occurred. In Xenia, Ohio, a tornado destroyed half the town and killed 34 people. The warning for Xenia was issued 20 minutes before impact. It was broadcast on local radio, but many people did not hear it because they were watching television. The television stations did not interrupt their programming to broadcast the warning. The FCC did not require them to do so until after the outbreak. In Brandenburg, Kentucky, a tornado killed 31 people. The warning was issued, but it was broadcast only on a low-power radio station that had a limited range. Many residents could not receive the signal. In Monticello, Indiana, a tornado killed 18 people. The warning was issued, but it was broadcast on a station that went off the air at sunset. By the time the tornado hit, the station was silent. The pattern was consistent. The warning was there, but the channel was broken. The National Weather Service report on the super outbreak was blunt. It stated that the warning system had failed because of inadequate dissemination facilities. It recommended that the federal government establish a nationwide system of continuous weather broadcasts on a frequency dedicated solely to that purpose. This recommendation led directly to the modern NOAA Weather Radio network. It also led to the development of the Specific Area Message Encoding, or SAME system, which allowed weather radios to be activated only for warnings in a specific county. Before SAME, a weather radio would activate for any warning within 100 miles, which led to complacency. After SAME, the alerts were targeted. The technology improved, but the human factor remained. In Guin, the human factor was the most painful. The people who died were not ignorant. They were not reckless. They were simply disconnected. The mother who had put her children to bed, not knowing that the storm was coming. The father who had driven home from work, not hearing the warning because his car radio was broken. The elderly couple who had gone to sleep early, not realizing that their town was about to be erased. These were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They trusted that the system would protect them. The system did not. The story of Guin is a story about the gap between what we know and what we do with that knowledge. It is a story about the difference between a forecast and a warning. A forecast tells you what might happen, a warning tells you what is happening, but a warning is only useful if it reaches the person who needs it. In Guin, the warning was issued, the forecast was accurate. But the distance from the National Weather Service office in Birmingham to the ears of a mother in her home was 12 miles and a broken radio station. That distance was fatal. In the years after the tornado, the town of Guin rebuilt, the school was replaced, the houses were rebuilt, the cotton gin was restored, but the town was never the same. The population declined, many families moved away. The ones who stayed carried the memory of that night. They built a small memorial near the site of the old train depot. It listed the names of the 33 who died. It did not mention the radio station or the power lines or the ham operator's antenna, but everyone who saw it knew the story. National Weather Service continued to improve its warning systems. By the 1990s, Doppler radar had been installed across the country. By the 2000s, cell phones could receive emergency alerts. By the 2010s, smartphone apps could push warnings directly to a person's pocket. The technology had advanced beyond anything the forecasters of 1974 could have imagined. But the question remained, would the warning reach the person who needed it? In some cases, it did. In other cases, it did not. The same gap that existed in Guin existed in Joplin in 2011, in Moore in 2013, in Beauregard in 2019. The technology changed, but the human vulnerability did not. People still died because they did not hear the warning. People still died because they heard the warning but did not act. People still died because they did not have a safe place to go. The Guin tornado is not an artifact of history. It is a living lesson. The Super Outbreak of 1974 was a turning point in the history of severe weather communication. It forced the federal government to invest in a dedicated weather radio network. It forced local communities to install sirens. It forced broadcasters to develop interruption protocols. It saved countless lives in the decades that followed, but it also revealed that no system is perfect. Every time a tornado warning is issued and someone does not hear it, the ghost of Guin reappears. The mile that was never covered becomes a mile that is still uncovered in some other place. On the morning of April 4, 1974, the United States Congress began receiving preliminary damage reports from the affected states. The numbers were staggering: over 300 dead, more than 6,000 injured, and property losses in the billions of dollars. The super outbreak had cut a path across the eastern half of the country that was unlike anything in recorded history. In the weeks that followed, the National Weather Service convened a special task force to investigate what had gone wrong. Their report, published later that year, was titled The Super Outbreak of 3-4 April 1974, a case study of the warning system. It was a document of self-examination, not self-congratulation. It listed every failure, every missed connection, every radio station that had gone silent, every telephone line that had snapped, every siren that had never been installed. And it made clear that the system had not failed because of a single error. It had failed because it was built on a web of fragile dependencies, and the tornado had broken every strand. The task force interviewed over 200 witnesses: meteorologists, broadcasters, emergency managers, survivors. The testimony from Guin was among the most telling. The ham operator who had tried to relay the warning described the moment his antenna came down. The station manager of WMXD explained why he could not switch to the backup transmitter. The power company representative described how the main feeder line to the town had been severed by a falling tree before the tornado even arrived. The sheriff's deputy who had been dispatched to drive through the town said he had turned around after encountering down power lines and flooded roads. He had not made it past the edge of town. The warning had been issued, but it had never arrived. The congressional hearings that followed were chaired by Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota. He asked the director of the National Weather Service directly, how many people died because they did not hear the warning? The director answered carefully. He said it was impossible to know for certain, but the best estimate was that at least half of the fatalities in the super outbreak could have been avoided if the warnings had reached the public. That number was approximately 150 people. 150 people who had died not because the tornado was unstoppable, but because the information was blocked. The hearings led to the Weather Service Modernization Act of 1975, which allocated federal funds for the expansion of the National Weather Radio network. At the time, only about 40 NOAA weather radio transmitters existed nationwide, covering less than 10% of the population. The goal was to blanket the country with continuous broadcasts on the frequency of 162.40 MHz, but the funding was slow. By 1980, only about 200 transmitters had been built. It would take another 15 years before the network approached full coverage. In the meantime, communities were left to fend for themselves. In Guin, the town council voted to install a civil defense siren. It was a single, old-fashioned air raid siren mounted on a pole near the volunteer fire department. It could be heard for about half a mile. The town had a population of 2,000 spread over several square miles. The siren was not enough, but it was something. The council also worked with the local telephone company to install a dedicated warning line that bypassed the central office. It was a direct line from the National Weather Service in Birmingham to the fire department. If the power went out, the line would still work because it was powered by the telephone company's central battery. It was a small improvement, but it was a start. The lessons of Guin also spread beyond Alabama. In Ohio, the town of Xenia had been destroyed by a powerful F5 tornado. The warning there had been broadcast on a local radio station, but many residents had been watching television. The television stations had not interrupted their programming because they did not have a formal agreement with the National Weather Service. After the outbreak, the Federal Communications Commission issued a directive requiring all broadcast stations to have a plan for interrupting regular programming to broadcast severe weather warnings. The National Weather Service also began developing a direct feed to television stations, using a teletype system that would trigger an on-screen crawl. By the late 1970s, the first emergency broadcast system tests were conducted, yet the gap between the warning and the public persisted. In 1979, a tornado struck Wichita Falls, Texas, killing 42 people. The warning was issued 25 minutes before the tornado hit. It was broadcast on all local radio and television stations, but many residents did not understand what a tornado warning meant. They thought it meant a tornado had been sighted far away. They did not know it meant imminent danger. The National Weather Service realized that the language of warnings needed to be standardized. Tornado warning became a specific term with a specific meaning. A tornado has been sighted or indicated by radar. Take cover immediately. Tornado watch meant conditions are favorable. Be alert. The public was educated through school programs, pamphlets, and public service announcements. But education takes time, and during that time more tornadoes struck. The 1980s brought another innovation, the Doppler radar. The first experimental Doppler radar was installed at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Norman, Oklahoma, in the late 1970s. It could detect rotation within a storm, giving meteorologists the ability to issue warnings based on radar data alone, not just visual sightings. By 1990, the National Weather Service had begun deploying the WSR Rate 8D radar network, also known as NEXRAD. It was a massive improvement. Warnings could be issued earlier, with greater accuracy. The average lead time for a tornado warning increased from about 5 minutes in the 1970s to about 13 minutes by the early 2000s. But lead time does not matter if the warning does not reach the person. In 1999, a series of tornadoes struck Oklahoma and Kansas in early May. One of them, an F5 that hit the town of Moore, Oklahoma, killed 36 people. The warnings for Moore were issued with an average lead time of 16 minutes. But a study later found that only about 60% of residents had heard the warning before the tornado struck. The rest had been asleep or had no access to a weather radio or had tuned out the sirens because they had heard them so many times before. The study concluded that the biggest challenge was not detection but communication. People needed to receive the warning in a way that commanded their attention and prompted them to act. The answer seemed to lie in personal devices. By the early 2000s, cell phones could receive text messages. The first wireless emergency alerts were tested in 2008. By 2012, the system was fully operational. For the first time, a person could receive a tornado warning directly on a device they carried with them everywhere. It was the closest the system had come to achieving what the National Weather Service had envisioned in 1974, a direct line from the forecaster to the individual. But even this had weaknesses. The alerts were based on cell tower coverage. If a cell tower was damaged, the alert might not reach everyone in the warning area, and the alert was a generic sound. Some people ignored it, others did not understand what it meant, and still others were in areas with no cell service. The 2011 Super Outbreak, which occurred 37 years after the 1974 outbreak, demonstrated both the progress and the persistence of the problem. From April 25 to 28, 2011, a massive storm system produced over 300 tornadoes across the southeastern United States. More than 300 people died. The warnings were issued with an average lead time of 24 minutes. Doppler radar, satellite imagery, and computer models had never been better, but the death toll was still high. In Alabama alone, over 200 people died. The state was hit again and again. In the town of Tuscaloosa, a powerful EF4 tornado killed 52 people. The warning was issued 22 minutes before it struck. Many people heard the warning, they took shelter, but some did not. Some were in mobile homes, some were in vehicles, some were in houses without basements. The warning could not protect them from the physical violence of the tornado, but it could have given them time to get to a better location. After the 2011 outbreak, the National Weather Service conducted a comprehensive review. They found that while lead times had improved, the public's response had not. Many people still did not know the difference between a watch and a warning. Many still thought they could outrun a tornado in their car. Many still believed that a tornado could not cross a river or a hill. These misconceptions were decades old. They had been documented after the 1974 outbreak. They had been addressed in public education campaigns, and yet they persisted. The review also found that the most vulnerable populations were the same as they had been in 1974: the elderly, the poor, the rural, the isolated. In Guin, the isolation was physical. In 2011, the isolation was both physical and social. People living in poverty often did not have a weather radio. They did not have a smartphone. They did not have a safe room. They relied on neighbors or family members to warn them. But if the neighbors were also unaware, the chain of information broke. The review recommended that the National Weather Service work with local emergency managers to identify vulnerable populations and develop tailored communication strategies. It was a good idea, but it required funding, staffing, and coordination that many communities did not have. The story of Guin, then, is not just about a tornado in a small Alabama town in 1974. It is about the enduring challenge of warning people in a way that saves lives. Every improvement in technology has been met with a new set of obstacles. Radar improved, but people did not act. Weather radios became available, but people did not buy them. Cell phones became ubiquitous, but the alerts were not always integrated. The gap between the warning and the recipient has narrowed, but it has not closed. In 2019, a tornado struck the small community of Beauregard, Alabama, east of Montgomery. It was an EF4 that killed 23 people. The warning was issued 30 minutes before it hit. The lead time was generous, but many of the victims were in mobile homes with limited options for shelter. Some heard the warning but did not move to a stronger building. Others did not hear it because they were asleep. The age of the victims ranged from 6 to 89. Same pattern emerged: the elderly, the poor, the isolated. The same questions were asked: why did they not hear the warning? Why did they not take shelter? And the same answer emerged: the system had advanced, but the humans had not. The Guin tornado remains a symbol of that systemic gap. It is remembered not because it was the deadliest or the widest or the strongest, but because it was the clearest example of a silent warning. The radio station had been broadcasting the alert. The power went out. The backup generator did not start. The telephone lines were down. The ham operator's antenna fell. The sheriff's deputy could not get through. Every possible channel was severed. And 23 people died in their homes unaware. The National Weather Service now maintains a network of over 1,000 NOAA Weather Radio transmitters covering more than 95% of the population. The emergency alert system can interrupt any broadcast. Cell phones can receive wireless emergency alerts. Social media platforms can push warnings instantly. The technology that failed in Guin has been replaced many times over, but the underlying fragility remains. A warning is only as good as the path it travels to reach the person who needs it. And that path can still be broken by a downed power line, a failed cell tower, a dead battery, a sleeping person, a misunderstanding, a denial, a lack of options. The Super Outbreak of 1974 forced the United States to rethink how it communicates severe weather. The reforms that followed saved countless lives, but the human factor cannot be engineered away. The distance from the forecast to the action is not just a matter of miles. It is a matter of trust, of understanding, of fear, of hope, of the belief that the warning applies to you. In Guin, the warning applied to everyone, but no one heard it. And on that night in April 1974, the silence was absolute. In the weeks following the Guin tornado, the community was faced with a task that would define its recovery. The dead had to be identified, the injured treated, and the missing accounted for. The search for survivors lasted into the daylight hours of April 4, 1974. By noon, the National Guard had arrived. They set up a command post at the high school, which had been damaged but not destroyed. The school gymnasium became a temporary morgue. The cafeteria became a shelter for the homeless. The library became a communications center. The town of Guin had a population of about 2,000 people before the tornado. After, it felt like a town of ghosts. The Red Cross arrived with supplies. Volunteers from nearby towns came with chainsaws, blankets, food, and water. The state police established a perimeter around the damaged area to prevent looting. It was a necessary measure. In the chaos of disaster, some people take advantage, but the people of Guin were not looters. They were neighbors and they were grieving. The first funerals were held on April 6th. 23 caskets, each one representing a life ended too soon. The youngest victim was 2 years old. The oldest was 73. The funerals were held in shifts because no single church could accommodate all the mourners. The community gathered in the largest remaining church, the First Baptist Church of Guin, which had sustained only minor damage. The pastor read from the Book of Psalms. The congregation sang Amazing Grace. Outside, the sun was shining. It was a cruel contrast. The National Weather Service sent a team of investigators to Guin on April 5th. Their task was to document the damage, estimate the wind speed, and classify the tornado. The team was led by Dr. Theodore Fujita, the Japanese-American meteorologist who had developed the Fujita scale for measuring tornado intensity. Fujita had been studying tornadoes for over a decade. He had flown over the damaged paths of the 1974 Super Outbreak in a small aircraft, taking thousands of photographs. He was meticulous. He measured the width of the damaged path, the length, the pattern of destruction. In Guin, he found evidence of winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Classified the tornado as an F5, the highest rating on the scale. It was one of only 7 F5 tornadoes in the Super Outbreak. Fujita's investigation revealed something else. The tornado had not moved in a straight line, it had wobbled, it had occluded, it had produced multiple vortices. The damage pattern showed areas of extreme destruction next to areas of relative preservation. One house was completely swept away. The house next to it was still standing with only minor damage. This was not unusual for an F5 tornado. The winds could vary dramatically over short distances, but the pattern of destruction in Guin was particularly erratic. It suggested that the tornado had been at its peak intensity when it passed through the town. It had arrived at the worst possible moment. The investigation also focused on the warning failure. The team interviewed residents, radio station employees, telephone operators, and emergency personnel. The chain of events was reconstructed. At 10:15 p.m., the National Weather Service had issued a tornado warning for Marion County. The warning was received by the Guin radio station, WJBB, which immediately broadcast it. The station had a backup generator, but it was designed to power only the transmitter, not the studio or the telephone system. When the power failed at 10:20 p.m., the generator kicked on, but the station could not receive any new information. The telephone lines were down. The station manager, who was also the announcer, could not reach the National Weather Service for updates. He could not hear the NOAA Weather Radio broadcast because the studio receiver was not on the backup power. It was broadcasting blind. The National Weather Service had tried to contact the station by telephone, but the lines were dead. They had tried to contact the sheriff's office, but the telephone lines there were also dead. The sheriff's deputy, who had heard the warning on his patrol car radio, had tried to drive to Guin to sound the alarm, but the road was blocked by debris. By the time he reached the town, the tornado had already passed. The warning had been issued. The storm had been tracked. The technology had worked. But the human chain had failed. The question that followed was not about the tornado, it was about the system. How could a warning be issued and yet not reach the people who needed it? The answer was complex. It involved the limitations of radio transmission, the vulnerability of the telephone network, the design of backup power systems, and the geography of rural Alabama. But it also involved something more fundamental, the assumption that a warning, once issued, would be heard. That assumption was wrong. In the years after 1974, the National Weather Service studied the communication failures of the Super Outbreak extensively. They concluded that the most critical vulnerability was the reliance on a single channel of communication. In Guin, the primary channel was the radio station. When that channel failed, there was no backup. The telephone system was the secondary channel, but it failed at the same time. The sheriff's office had patrol car radios, but the deputy could not reach the town in time. The ham radio operators had their own network, but the antenna had collapsed. Every channel had a single point of failure. The solution was redundancy. The National Weather Service began to invest in multiple communication paths. The emergency broadcast system, later upgraded to the emergency alert system, was designed to override all broadcasts. NOAA Weather Radio was expanded to cover more areas with more transmitters and more frequencies. The system was designed so that if one channel failed, another could take over. But redundancy is expensive. It requires infrastructure, maintenance, and funding. In the 1970s, the funding was limited. The expansion was slow. The Guin tornado also prompted changes in the way warnings were written. Before 1974, tornado warnings were often vague. They used phrases like possible tornado activity or severe weather expected. After the Super Outbreak, the National Weather Service standardized the language. Warnings became more specific. They included the exact location of the storm, its direction of movement, and the time of arrival. They used plain language. They avoided technical terms. The goal was to make the warning as clear and actionable as possible. But clarity alone was not enough. The warning still had to reach the person. In rural areas, the radio was often the only source of information. In Guin, the radio station was the lifeline. When it went silent, the town went dark. The lesson was that a warning is only as good as the network that delivers it, and the network is only as good as its weakest link. The human impact of the Guin tornado extended beyond the immediate loss of life. The survivors were left with trauma that would last a lifetime. The children who lost their parents, the parents who lost their children, the grandparents who lost their homes. The community that lost its center. The high school was repaired, but the gymnasium remained closed for a year. The downtown district was rebuilt, but many businesses never reopened. The population of Guin declined in the years after the tornado. Some families moved away. They could not bear to stay. The mental health effects of tornadoes were not well understood in 1974. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet a recognized diagnosis. The survivors of the Guin tornado were expected to carry on. They were praised for their resilience. But the resilience came at a cost. Many survivors experienced nightmares, anxiety, and depression. Some could not sleep during thunderstorms. Many could not hear the sound of wind without feeling fear. The silence of that night stayed with them. In the years that followed, the town held a memorial every year on April 3rd. The names of the 23 victims were read aloud. The church bells were rung. The community gathered to remember. The memorial was a way of acknowledging the loss, of holding space for the grief. It was also a way of honoring the lessons learned. Each year, the ceremony included a moment of silence. It was a deliberate choice. The silence that had killed them was now a symbol of remembrance. The National Weather Service continued to study the Super Outbreak of 1974 for decades. It became a case study in meteorology courses, emergency management training, and disaster response planning. The tornadoes of April 3, 1974 were a turning point in the history of severe weather forecasting. They exposed the gaps in the system. They forced reforms. They saved lives in the years to come. But the cost was high. In 2019, the National Weather Service released a comprehensive report on the Super Outbreak of 1974. The report was titled The Tornado Outbreak of April 3, 1974, Lessons Learned and Progress Made. It was a detailed analysis of the meteorological, technological, and social factors that had contributed to the disaster. The report concluded that the most significant improvement since 1974 had been in the accuracy and timeliness of warnings. It also concluded that the most significant remaining challenge was communication. The technology had improved, but the human behavior had not. The report identified several persistent barriers to effective warning communication. The first was the lack of awareness among vulnerable populations. Many people still did not know what to do when a warning was issued. The second was the lack of access to warnings among the most vulnerable. The elderly, the poor, and the rural were still the least likely to receive a warning in time. The third was the problem of warning fatigue. When warnings were issued frequently, people began to ignore them. They assumed that nothing bad would happen. They stopped taking shelter. The fourth was the problem of denial. When a warning was issued, some people refused to believe it. They convinced themselves that the tornado would miss them. They stayed in their homes, some of them died. The Guin tornado was a perfect illustration of all these barriers. The warning was issued, the technology worked, but the people did not hear it, and even if they had heard it, some of them might not have acted. The human factor is the hardest variable to control. It cannot be engineered away. It cannot be solved by a better radar or a faster computer. It requires education, trust, and a willingness to act, and those things are not easy to build. The story of Guin is not just a story about a tornado. It is a story about the gap between what is possible and what is real. It is a story about the distance between the forecast and the person who needs it. It is a story about the fragility of the chain that connects the warning to the action. And it is a story about the silence that can kill. As the sun set on April 3, 1974, the people of Guin went about their evening routines. They listened to the radio. They watched television. They talked on the telephone. They did not know that a storm was approaching. They did not know that the warning was being broadcast. They did not know that the power would fail, that the backup generator would not start, that the telephone lines would go dead, that the deputy could not get through, that the ham operator's antenna would fall. They did not know that in a few hours, 23 of them would be dead. The silence that night was absolute. It was a silence that should not have existed. The technology to break it was there. The warning was issued. The storm was tracked. The information was available. But the chain was broken. And the people died because of it. The lessons of Guin are still relevant today. The technology has improved. The warnings are better, the lead time is longer, the network is more redundant, but the human factor remains. People still do not hear the warning, they still do not act, they still die. The gap between the forecast and the person is narrower, but it is not closed. And until it is closed, the silence of Guin will echo through every tornado warning that is issued but not heard. At 5:15 p.m. on April 3, 1974, the National Weather Service office in Birmingham, Alabama, issued a tornado warning for Marion County. The warning was valid until 6 p.m. The storm that would hit Guin was still forming near the Mississippi line. The meteorologist on duty wrote the warning by hand, then handed it to the teletype operator. The operator typed the message and sent it over the National Weather Wire. The broadcast stations that subscribed to the wire received the warning within seconds. The problem was that not all stations subscribed. Some stations relied on telephone calls from the Weather Service. Others relied on local spotters. The warning traveled through a patchwork of relays. It was only as fast as the slowest link. At 5:30 p.m., the storm crossed into Alabama. Radar showed a hook echo. The signature was unmistakable. A tornado was on the ground. The Weather Service telephoned the sheriff's office in Hamilton. The dispatcher answered. He was told that a tornado was approaching Guin. He hung up and tried to call the Guin police station. The line was busy. He tried again, still busy. He tried the town switchboard. The operator said the lines were overloaded. People were calling friends and family. The storm was close. The lines were jammed. At 5:40 p.m., the deputy who had been trying to reach Guin decided to drive there. He left Hamilton and headed south on Highway 5. The road was winding and narrow. The rain was heavy. The wind was picking up. He could see the sky turning green, a weather phenomenon known to precede violent tornadoes. He pushed the accelerator. The speedometer climbed. He was 5 miles from Guin when the tornado crossed the road ahead of him. He saw the funnel cloud touch the ground. He saw debris rising. Saw a house lift off its foundation. He knew he was too late. He stopped the car and waited. The tornado moved northeast. It missed him by a quarter mile. He got back on the road and drove into Guin. At 5:45 p.m., the tornado entered the town limits. It was a quarter mile wide. Winds were estimated at over 200 miles per hour. The National Weather Service later classified it as an F5, the highest on the Fujita scale. The tornado struck the high school gymnasium first. The roof was lifted off. The walls collapsed. The gymnasium had been built with steel beams, but they twisted like wire. The storm then hit the downtown district. The bank building was flattened. The grocery store was gone. The post office was reduced to rubble. The tornado moved through residential neighborhoods. It did not skip. It did not pause. It destroyed every structure in its path. At 5:50 p.m., the deputy arrived at the edge of town. He found a landscape that looked like a war zone. The streets were covered in debris. The houses were gone. The trees were stripped of bark. The cars were overturned. He began a search for survivors. He found a woman lying in a ditch. She was bleeding from the head. He lifted her and carried her to his car. He drove her to the nearest hospital, which was in Hamilton. The emergency room was overwhelmed. Doctors were treating patients in the hallway. The dead were placed in a separate room. The living were triaged by severity. By 6 p.m., the National Weather Service had received reports that the tornado had already passed through Guin. The warning was still valid. The storm was moving northeast at 50 miles per hour. It would continue to produce tornadoes for another 2 hours, but for Guin, the worst was over. The immediate rescue effort began. Neighbors helped neighbors. Volunteer firefighters showed up with chainsaws. The Alabama National Guard was activated. The Red Cross set up a shelter in the church that had survived. The official death toll was 23. 21 died on impact. 2 died later from injuries. The injured numbered over 100. The damage was estimated at $10 million, a significant sum for a small town. The federal government declared Marion County a disaster area. President Nixon authorized federal assistance, but the assistance came after the fact. It could not undo the loss. Investigators arrived the next day. They came from the National Weather Service, the National Severe Storms Laboratory, and the American Red Cross. They surveyed the damage. They interviewed survivors. They analyzed the radar data. They reconstructed the timeline. They found that the warning had been issued 17 minutes before the tornado hit Guin. 17 minutes was enough time to take shelter, but the warning had not been received. The radio station was off the air. The telephone lines were jammed. The ham radio operator's antenna was down. The deputy had tried to drive, but he could not arrive in time. The system had failed at every point. The investigators asked the same question that would be asked again and again in the years to come. Why did no one hear the warning? The answer was a combination of technical failure and human limitation. The technical failures were clear. The radio station had no backup power. The telephone lines had no redundancy. The ham radio network had no backup antenna. The human limitations were less obvious. The residents of Guin had never experienced a tornado of that magnitude. They did not know what to look for. They did not know how to interpret the signs. They did not know that a green sky meant danger. They did not know that a sudden stillness meant the storm was near. The warning system assumed a baseline of knowledge that did not exist. The aftermath of the Guin tornado led to specific changes in the way warnings were communicated in rural Alabama. The National Weather Service began to install direct phone lines to critical facilities such as hospitals, schools, and emergency dispatch centers. The lines were dedicated and could not be used for other calls. They were tested weekly. They were intended to bypass the jammed switchboards that had caused the failure in 197-4. The Federal Communications Commission also became involved. The FCC required all broadcast stations to maintain backup power sources. The requirement was not just for the transmitter but for the entire station. If the main power went out, the generator had to start within 60 seconds. The stations were required to test the backup power monthly and to log the results. The FCC conducted spot inspections. Stations that failed could lose their license. Cost of compliance was significant, but the cost of non-compliance had already been measured in lives. At the state level, Alabama established a statewide emergency communication network. The network linked all county sheriff's offices, all National Guard units, and all major hospitals. The network used a combination of telephone lines, radio frequencies, and satellite links. It was designed to survive a failure in any single medium. The network was funded by the state legislature. It was maintained by the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. It was tested annually in a full-scale drill. The human changes were slower. The National Weather Service launched public education campaigns. The campaigns used brochures, radio announcements, and school presentations. They taught the signs of a tornado. They taught the phrase, "get in, get down, cover up." They emphasized that a warning was not a suggestion, it was a directive. The campaigns reached millions of people, but the campaigns could not reach everyone. The elderly, the isolated, the non-English speakers were still left out. The campaigns assumed a literate English-speaking population with access to media. That assumption was not always correct. 23 people died in Guin on April 3, 1974. Their names are recorded in the county courthouse. Their graves are marked in the town cemetery. Their memory is preserved in the annual memorial service, but their loss is not the final word. The changes that followed saved lives in later years. In 2011, when a super outbreak of tornadoes struck the same region, the death toll was lower. The warnings were faster. The communication was more reliable. The people were better prepared. The lessons of Guin had been learned. But the question remains, how many more towns are still waiting for those lessons to reach them? How many lives depend on a generator that has not been tested, a telephone line that is not dedicated, a radio station that has no backup? The silence of Guin echoes, but it is not the only silence. There are other towns, other storms, other warnings that are issued but not heard. The story of Guin is not over, it is still unfolding. Every time a warning fails to reach a person, the chain breaks again. The cost is measured in silence, and the silence is measured in lives.